Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever time zones that you're all joining in from. Um, Warm welcome to this particular session. My name is Raman. My full name is Raman Narasimhan. I am a Vice President at Cognizant Technology Solutions. I run the Artificial Intelligence Center of Excellence. And my background has been in the data and analytics space for well over 2.5 decades. In fact, I spent my entire lifetime only in this particular field and I've not done anything else different. So it gives me, first of all, a great pleasure to be actually speaking in a prestigious forum of this nature. So when QBOL colleagues approached us for a thought leadership session to be provided, I immediately jumped onto it because there's some fascinating developments that are going on in this particular space. And it would be my pleasure to actually share some of the experiences as well as what we are seeing in the market. And above all, I just hope that each and every one of you are keeping yourself very safe, your family, your near and dear ones, from the current pandemic. I would urge you to actually take utmost care of each and every one of you. So, the topic of my discussion today is actually decisioning in the new normal. So, what do we mean by this particular topic? If you look at it, for decades, in fact, even for centuries, decisioning has always been there. It's not something new. But what we are going through today, or what we are going through in this current period, is somewhat different. This is something that we have not seen before. We have not experienced of this size, scale, and complexity before. So, therefore, decisioning, when it comes to key managers, CEOs, CXOs, using data and AI to actually make critical business decisions, how that is actually fundamentally changing. And the primary part of my topic is going to be what is it that CXOs and other business leaders can actually look for as approaches to take on decisioning in the current climate. Now, this has been a topic that I have been also personally researching. I've been looking into it for quite some time. And through our experiences working with various clients, we have seen a general pattern that is emerging. Now, I just want to caution you saying that there will always be exceptions to this. There is no doubt about it. There will be areas where some of our clients would have probably been at the forefront of embracing a lot of new technology features that are emerging out there. Some will also be laggards equally, so like a typical product adoption cycle. So what I'm going to be covering today, mind you, it is more a thought leadership session. So one thing you can be all guaranteed is the fact that there will not be any technical jargons that I will be using which will confuse quite a few of you. It's going to be very simple language, simple messaging. And I also want to keep it as succinct as possible so that it doesn't get lost in any marketing or salesy pitch. So at the start, I'm going to be first of all introducing what do we mean by modern decisioning. I will then take a brief look at how we see the demand actually for data and analytics services shifting over the last 15 to 20 years. So let's take a good 2-decade view of it. And what exactly is happening in the current part or in the current phase. So we call it as an S-curve. And I'll explain to you what exactly is driving the current S-curve. And because of what is happening in the current S-curve and what businesses want to really achieve in the current climate, why should organizations be actually having an ambidextrous approach? So that's the next element that I would like to introduce. Given that you need to be ambidextrous, what could be the potential framework into which you can look at leveraging data and analytics in order to actually become a modern enterprise? And in doing so, what would be the challenges and opportunities? So, moving on, what do we mean by modern decisioning? Now, when we had a look at a cross section of the customers with whom we work, and we read several articles, talked to several analysts out there in the market, engaged with a lot of product vendors, there is this three-dimensional view of what we mean by a modern enterprise really stood out. Now, almost to every CIO, CXO to whom we spoke, really aspire, as much as it would have been a bold, hairy, and audacious goal, as they say. They wanted to operate or behave like a digitally native business. So they wanted to mimic like the Facebooks or the Amazons or the Netflixes of the world. They wanted all their decisions to be powered, and this is the important part, underline that, continuously. So the decision is not something that is like in a batch mode or in a phase mode, but foresight powers intelligence continuously. That continuous is something that I would like you to hold at the back of your mind. And last but not the least, many enterprises over several years of their existence had actually accumulated a ton of data. Everyone came across almost unequivocally and said, what can I do more with my data? How can I make money out of my data? So these three paradigms, these three dimensions really stood out. They wanted to make money out of the data. They wanted to drive decisions continuously and almost near real time. And they wanted to behave or operate like a digitally native business. So if that is what modern enterprises really aspire to do, or they really want to do, they need to be actually having modern decisioning principles embedded into their organization. And what we mean by modern decisioning is activation. And it could be any activation. It could be an activation of a business process. It could be an activation of even a strategy, or it could be an activation of a user control. Anything around activation, put a broad brush around activation. Activations are driven by decision. It's architected by deep analysis and fundamentally backed up by data that matters. So gone are the days when they wanted to take decisions based on the most experienced person inside the organization or the highly paid individual, as you may probably look at. So data-driven decision making is something that was forming at the heart of modern decisioning, powered by AI, ML, analytics, and so on. So modern enterprises require modern decisioning. Why? They wanted to operate like a business, digital native business, continuously driving decisions using intelligence, and at the same time monetizing data assets. This is a very simplistic view of why we need to approach decisioning backed up by data in a completely different paradigm altogether. Okay, let's take a side step and look at what is happening in the market. Now, most of you, a few of you may have probably traversed all these three big S-curves. Now, I, for one, personally, have been through this three-stage S-curves throughout my life. I've been in the 1995s when I was in this business, early 2000, and now. So back in those days, as some of you can recall, people put in an enormous amount of money to build massive data warehouses. Okay, some of them managed to actually crack it as an enterprise warehouse and so on. But the focus was get all the data, put it into it, and they used big appliance technologies and so on. Now, cut the chase and look at that. That particular phase really survived for about 15 years, so to speak. That mainstream business stood the test of time for 15 years. Good 15 years. This is not an accurate number to take it per se, but that was like a fairly stable S-curve. Now, if you move on to the next part of the S-curve, that is when the disruptions really started appearing on the horizon. Now, powered by some of the big digitally native companies who used non-orthodox technologies, especially around the big data side, organizations jumped onto the big data bandwagon. But then what they did was in that process, and without an element of criticism or whatever it is, everybody was right in their own way. They merely shifted the underlying data from an appliance-based ecosystem into a big data ecosystem on-premise, with the promise of several things. It could be from a cost optimization standpoint. It could be, I don't want to be tied into a particular proprietary platform. I want to be everything running on open source. I want more processing power. I'm now increasingly processing different types of data and so on. So whether it was the volume dimension or the variety dimension, pick up anything that you want. There was this clamor to move towards this big data, and a lot of organizations did move there. But the interesting part between the first S-curve and the second S-curve was in the first S-curve, the predominant part of decisioning was still hinging largely on insights, or it is like looking into your rearview mirror and taking a decision. The second part of the S-curve, when the early big data um, uh, took off or the adoption took off, it's not that enormously it transferred. There was a promise. It continues to be a promise, no doubt. And the promise largely lived on paper. So they wanted to actually power much more sophisticated decision making using very sophisticated predictive algorithms, no doubt about it. But the effort that went in predominantly in the S curve still largely remained in transitioning the data ecosystem from one world into another world. But what is happening? And if you cut immediately all the way till the last 2 to 3 years, possibly max of 3.5 years, what we are seeing is as much as the importance is there on continuing to shift towards not only the big data platforms, in some cases, you could possibly look at them as some of those late adopters, but cloud. Okay, driven by the migration to the cloud from a data ecosystem as well as from a compute. So the combination of compute and the storage promise from the cloud really drove several other offshoots. So real-time data insights and delivery, self-service reporting and visualizations. Um, and the nature of the projects also became in such that the business, unlike in the previous two S curves, did not have the appetite to wait for 6 months, 8 months, or 9 months until the first minimum viable product came out, or they actually had something to see from the system after such a long time. There was no longer this patience to say, okay, I will drive a 10-month program. It was all like, how quickly can I actually get to see some real, meaningful, tangible business value coming out of whatever that I'm doing there. This is largely shaping the current S curve. A number of things coming together. And we will see some of them as we actually move through these slides. What is it? So these are 6 factors, and these are 6 factors that you could possibly look at from a technology perspective. Okay. Without a doubt, the first one should possibly be fairly straightforward: cloud adoption. 3-4 years ago, there were a few industries where very reluctant to actually move onto the cloud. They were happy to move certain other parts of their businesses onto cloud, but when it comes to data and decisioning, there was still an element of hesitation because they considered that as their proprietary IP. So we don't want somebody to access our data and do something wrong with it. Banks, insurance companies, and other highly regulated businesses were very, very reluctant to actually even open a conversation around cloud. That is going away. Okay, so these organizations are very freely coming forward and saying, tell me, what can I actually do on the cloud? The second one that is actually taking a lot of interesting shapes as well as progress, very rapid progress, is around edge computing. Okay. Third one is, while organizations have started looking out for data in addition to what their internal transaction systems are giving, this big alarm around how do I be compliant, and various regulatory things like GDPR also have come on to place emphasis on organizations today. You should use data very sensibly, very responsibly, and in a way that does not infringe into an end consumer's proprietary rights and so on. So privacy, compliance issues, data related issues, data security related issues, especially because the data is going to be on the cloud, has also taken a center stage and a table stake. Now, in the previous two S curves, decision making at the end of the day was somewhat centralized. But today, decision making is needed almost for everybody who is working in an organization. Okay, everybody wants to actually make a decision using data rather than centralize that into the hands of a small number of people who were typically called as the decision makers. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that now enterprises feel that they need to empower their employees to make decisions on the ground so that they can be quick, agile, nimble, also at the same time in driving and taking their businesses forward. At every level of the organization, they want decision making to be pervasive. Look at it that way, rather than saying, give the decision making to everyone. It goes with the empowerment as well as the responsibility part of it. Now, predictions and prescriptions. This is an interesting part, and I'm sure some of you may disagree with me in the sense they may say, hey, this has always been around. It's true, it's been around. The usage of prescriptive algorithms or prescriptive techniques, as well as the usage of several predictive statistical algorithms or mathematical formulas, have been around in existence for decades together. Okay, just not 5, 10, 15 years, several decades. And there have been parts of businesses in every industry which have used this quite sophisticatedly. Several books have also been written on these topics, no doubt about it, about success stories. But what's driving the current S curve is this is getting into, again, the pervasive mode. So everybody actually wants this decision making to be driven by data and the application of analytics. It's just not data alone. So prediction has taken a much, much more massive space across the entire board. So much so that every organization is now thinking about expanding the scope of applying the power of prediction and the power of prescription in their day-to-day decision making. The sophistication of the algorithms, as well as the ability of the algorithms to exploit the computing power and the storage that is available, is the technology dimension that you can look at. Some of the algorithms that you can think of, especially in the machine learning world, in the past used to be more of a theoretical subject. It used to be like a research paper actually that was written. And even today, there are institutions where when you want to solve a problem in using a particular machine learning algorithm, they refer to a number of academic institution papers to understand whether X, Y, Z will work, how can we apply and all that. Limitations in computations as well as storage, the amount of data that was available, possibly did not make it viable for those organizations to try out all of that. Today, that is gone. There are newer varieties and newer forms of algorithms that people are actually testing out and bringing to the table, saying this is giving a much better predictive output. A classic example in this space is back in those days, classification and regression possibly used to be centralized within about a dozen to no more than about 1.5 dozen different varieties that people will test out. Today, a simple auto ML tool, if you just feed the data, can run in excess of hundreds of classification algorithms and come back at the click of a button and tell you that this is the best fit for you. People do misuse it at times, but it has got its own value. So that space is also like exploded. The time to decisioning, the decision and action latency is something that I told before. Businesses as well as users do not have actually the patience to wait for something to come out after 6 weeks or 4 weeks or after the entire load is finished and all that. That entire time has been now crunched. They want almost like real-time decision making or just-in-time decision making. So think about these as possibly a set of technology factors. Now, the last one, you may actually say, hey, is this really a technology stuff? It's like saying, because the technology supports or the technology has the ability to drive just-in-time or real-time decisioning, look at it from that particular perspective. Okay? Now, switch the game to the business side. Now, this is a very simplistic and fairly interesting view to look at. Now, almost every organization went through this digital transformation, big buzzword. Everybody talked about digital. Newspapers talked about it, analysts, product vendors, systems integrators, organizations, CEOs, CXOs, everybody said, oh, we want to go onto this digital bandwagon. We want to be going through a digital transformation, so on. Brilliant. Nothing wrong with it. It's got its own space. People make a lot of money in that entire ecosystem. However, if you look at what organizations largely did as part of their digital transformation, and if you apply it within the context of data and analytics, you can think about these two entry points. Look at these two entry points on the far left-hand side of the slide as where data gets actually generated. Okay, the first one is a number of applications had wrappers around them. So, for example, an online retail banking application where people traditionally went into a website and logged in and all that. Retail banks went on to create a mobile interface. So you could actually do your banking. Most of the transactions that you can possibly do from your online banking was now possible from a mobile interface. The mobile interface, think of it as a wrapper. It can generate some data. So I gave a simplistic example, but you can think of several of those kind of applications around which wrappers were written. Underneath, the systems could have been still in legacy, mainframe, COBOL, etc., etc. Don't worry about that part. But these wrappers alone around the operational systems generated a ton of data, which became very interesting for organizations. The second part of it was as IoT picked up, as Internet of Things exploded, as smart devices were introduced, as smart services and processes were introduced, products or services, usage of them by everyone, like people like you, me, etc. As we started using products and services of this nature, that in itself generated a lot of data. A simplistic example that I can give is take the energy and utilities sector where smart meters were installed in every home. Previously, meter readings were taken at one point. After 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 2 months, they took another meter reading. Nobody knew what happened in between, or at least the organizations didn't know. They just knew that, XYZ consumed 1,000 kilowatts of power over 2 months. Today, it is possible with smart meters that as you use, you can get it down to 15 minutes. And in some cases, it can even be configured to 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes, how exactly is your individual consumption inside the house can be actually tracked. So that is what is called in-use data. So as you switch on your microwave in the morning at 6 o'clock, or you actually switch on your heater for taking a shower, or you switch on your air condition, whatever it is going to keep going up and down. So energy distribution companies, as well as energy providers, as well as people who actually are in the electricity business, can sit back and look at how your usage is spanning across an individual day. Based on that, they can take a hell of a lot of a decision. I mean, let's not even go there, but it's like saying they can even tailor make a tariff plan at an individual level. That is what I mean by in-use data. So these two powerful things that generated a whole raft of new data, when intelligence was applied on top of it, gave rise to a whole new world of possibilities. A lot of companies actually packaged all these as saying that we are going through this digital transformation. In going through this, as we change a lot of things in our business. Now, if you take the same electricity example, they went from traditional meters or conventional meters into smart meters. That may be actually called for them as we are going through this digital transformation. What is the smart meter doing? It is giving you more data at an individual level. What can you then do when you apply intelligence on top of it? One of two things. One, you can actually improve the overall efficiency or the effectiveness of the organization, which is an inward looking focus. Or with that data that you actually generate, you can actually create absolutely new value. And I'll give you an example here also. So one of the Australian banks that we know typically offered student loans to immigrant students who are coming into Australia for studies. So the bank was originally looking at a student as a student, loan application, they gave out a loan. But they got to know a lot more about the students in such a way that they said, what if I actually take this data and create new products and services? So they went and partnered with people who will give accommodation, people who will give them, mobile phones, etc. So a bouquet of services that a typical student would want when he or she goes into a new country to take up higher education, the bank came forward to create a new suite of services. It's like a concierge service to sit in front of a student and say, I'm not going to give you only the loan, I'm going to be giving you everything that you need. So come to me as a single stop. They then collaborated with a number of other ecosystem partners, shared a bit of data, brought those services into the student so that the student didn't have to go to 15 other players in order to make himself settled into that new country. Classic example of creating new value. And as you can see, it is new products and services out of this. Let me move on. So given these two changes, look at what is happening. Why this ambidextrous part of it is really coming in. So there will be organizations, there will be a need, continuous need for evolution. So what you see on the left-hand side will still be in vogue for a few more years. Organizations will continue to evolve, especially some of the traditional bricks and mortar businesses. There is always going to be an aspiration for scaling up, optimizing, cost control, and all that. At the same time, another part of the organization or within the organization's agenda, there is a clarion call for revolutionizing some of the things that they are possibly doing, which is not going to make sense in the new world. The speed at which they actually want to be driving their decisions, as well as delivering products and services. How can they be more creative in comparison to their competition? And how can they come up with new breakthrough products and services? So this ambidextrous means this 1 foot in your traditional business or 1 foot in your core competency, 1 foot always looking at into the future to say, what else can I do, something new that I've not done before? This needs a completely different form of handling. And if you want to power decisions for running an organization in an ambidextrous way, we can look at what are the various options which are there in front of you. So this is a simple framework. This is what I told about. How can an organization approach it? So given all that you saw in the previous slides, there is a technology push, there is a business priority, there is a need for you to be ambidextrous. Now, how can you then bring all this together? And this again is from a data and analytics perspective. So I'm not expanding it into several things. I'm now focusing more on saying, how can data and analytics actually help you? So a simple framework in front of you. What does the framework tell you? It's got a simple 2-quadrant one. As you can see, data on the x-axis, business capability on the y-axis. Now, the far left-hand corner, the left quadrant, is you're playing with the existing data that you've traditionally played with, and you're delivering the same capability. What would that mean? That we call it as optimize. And a classic example of optimize is, you want to shift a ton of your data that is there in your existing appliance-based or any other database onto the cloud. It's a cost play predominantly. Okay. Or you may actually try out applying sophisticated machine learning to still drive the same thing, like for example, prevention of attrition of employees or customers or agents, whatever it is. But you're still using the same data. Attrition would have been something that would have been attempted and would have been measured and monitored on an ongoing basis. Now you're applying AI/ML to just figure out why people are actually leaving your company. So as a capability, it is not new, but as an insight, it could be new. But the data still could be the same. Move to the far right-hand corner, what we call as experiment. This is like using new data to make decisions as well as deliver new capability. Okay, this is where you go back to the Australian bank example that I gave, launching completely new products and services that you have traditionally not been there at all. Now, on the right-hand corner, it's using new data, but still delivering largely the same business capability. And I'll give you an example of a typical commercial insurer. So commercial insurance needs quite a bit of data in order to understand risks when a commercial insurer underwrites a particular building for risk. So back in those days, people used to go with a camera, take a photograph of all the other surrounding things around the building, whether there is a petrol station or a railway line and so on and so forth. Today, you can actually send a drone image, you can send in a drone, capture the images, and you can use that images to actually write much more sophisticated risks, because a drone is going to give you a lot more sophisticated view of the entire building. A combination of data from a variety of different sources can put a lot more power in the hands of an underwriter. And if you actually build a much more cleverer underwriting application, you can actually be in a much better position to write the risk in a much more sophisticated way. So that is a classic example of using newer forms of data and potentially thinking about how you can reimagine the way that you are doing your existing business. Same underwriting function, but using new data to completely reimagine the way you want to look at underwriting. That's one quadrant. And the top left hand side is same data, but you're delivering completely new capability, something that you've not done before, or you've not been into a new market or into a new region. So the example that is quoted out there is a call center. A call center data, call centers have been around for a long time, but how can you apply perhaps AI, ML, etc. on top of the call center data, which is again your own data, nothing new. You're not buying or borrowing from anybody else, or it's not coming from outside the organization, but you're actually using the data to drive something new from understanding what your customer sentiments are. So keep this in mind. Very simple: new data, old data, or existing data, new capability, existing capability. And if you interject these two, there are these four options that are there. So if you go and present this to any business stakeholder, he's going to say, yeah, I may want to pick one or two of these quadrants. I may want to probably start off in the optimized side. I want to cut down my cost. That's my immediate priority. Or somebody else may say, I've navigated this journey. I want to come up with completely new products and services for my customers. Tell me, what can I do? What more data do I need to actually go and buy or get or source or use, etc.? So you could be operating in the experiment quadrant, or you could be operating in a couple of quadrants, or you could be operating in all the quadrants. So how much amount of energy, time, effort, focus that management wants to put in can actually be segmented very nicely into these four buckets to say, how do you want to approach the entire data and analytics agenda for the organization? Now, quickly moving on. In this particular exercise, this is also an ambidextrous journey. In this exercise, you are going to encounter a set of challenges. And I'll call out a few of them in the interest of time. If you take the optimized quadrant, for example, there are a plethora of technologies that are available today that is actually driving the current S-curve. On account of that, you are going to say, hey, which one do I select best? And this is a nightmare. For any CIO, it's like saying, I've got, an entire landscape filled with so many of these product vendors and technology. Should I do it this way? Should I do it that way? Should I, invest in, this cloud, multi-cloud, single cloud, hybrid cloud, blah, 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 which one is the best and so on. That is a usual challenge that, takes quite a bit of time for a decision making. The second one is in the evolve quadrant, as you can see, how do I establish a differentiation? How do I actually come up with a new capability that can far outstretch my competition, but yet using only my own data? It's like squeezing your data a lot more, but delivering a new capability needs a completely different level of creativity altogether. If you go to the far right-hand side on the experiment side, sometimes experiments can turn out to be quite time consuming. So if you don't put your hands around the experiment side, meaning if you're actually venturing into something that you've not done before at all, using everything as new, you want to deliver new capability, you want to use new data, it can end up being like a runaway train. Okay. Now, there is a fear of failure also. What if at the end of 6 months or 7 months, there is nothing that you could create, nothing you could come up with? And was it a good learning lesson? How can you make a decision to say what would be the impact of failure there? So that actually gets into people's mind and say, what if I fail? Do I really want to fail? And if on the bottom right-hand corner, it's because you're going to be playing around with new data, one of the common challenges that comes up is, how do I reskill my employees for them to use the data, process the data, not only that, make decisions using that data? Something that you have not seen before at all. And it goes hand in hand with the experiment quadrant as well. As much as there are challenges, there are very, very good outcomes as well. Okay, there are the benefits. Now, cost effectiveness in the bottom left-hand corner is probably going to save a good amount of dollars for you, which you can actually reinvest in any one of the other quadrants. So if you can squeeze some amount of from your denominator, you can put something that is going to push your revenue, which is your numerator. Okay. The right-hand corner is the one. Go back to the first definition in my first slide around monetizing data assets. In the reimagine quadrant, go back to the Australian example that I gave you. It's, yes, it is data that you collected out of, let's say, your customers, but you actually used it to create new products and services. This is the real opportunity for you to think about monetizing some value from the data. Um, in the experiment quadrant, if you are successful, yeah, it could be a breakthrough product. It could make a ton of money, just as the big product vendors like Apple and others. That would be the next big blockbuster product or service that you could come up with if you put your focus onto that experiment. And again, it's powered by data and analytics. On the evolve quadrant, obviously, substantial improvements in the way that you actually drive your businesses, which can either be a denominator or a numerator, but invariably it's the numerator side, which is the revenue side of it. Which then brings to the last slide and the last part that I want to conclude. So, how do you bring all this together? And if you want to drive such kind of a wide, diverse set of needs from a data and analytics standpoint, and let's say the universal mantra for it is to go towards a platform based approach, or you want to actually have a platform based approach for powering both your data lakes and your analytics services, there are these four key considerations that you can actually have. Four perspectives, I would say. One is you want somebody who can actually offer you that kind of portability. Multi-platform capability. So today, a good number of organizations are thinking about a combination. It's probably not a single cloud. There are people who still adopt the single cloud offering, but invariably it is multi-cloud, partly on-premise, partly on the cloud. I'm going to have a combination of AWS and GCP together. I'm going to use GCP for something. I'm going to use AWS for something. I want all these things to work seamlessly very well and fine. That's a standard table stakes conversation today. I want it to be cost effective. So all these, the first one and the second one should not come to me at a price that I would probably struggle to go and place it in front of the business. And at the same time, while all this is happening, while all these things are changing, I don't want my end users to be actually left out. So they should not get completely worried about all these fancy new technologies. And therefore, I want to drive a very high degree of self-service also. Now, self-service also has been a nirvana type aspiration for several organizations. Some have achieved it, some are in that particular path, some have miserably failed. But self-service has now once again come back into the mainstream as something that businesses want to drive. And therefore, if you combine all the four of them and say, how do I keep these four? How do I actually address the four quadrants that you saw? How do I be ambidextrous? How do I leverage the power of those factors that is driving the current S curve? All of them put together, if you want a single unified data and analytics platform to actually drive you, Qbol as an organization has got a very compelling offering. I think the subsequent sessions will throw a lot more light into how you can actually look at Qbol, which can be very enlightening for most of you. So with that, I would like to thank each and every one of you for not only giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts. I would also like to get feedback from each one of you. If there is anything that I would want to actually improve, that would be really great. If some of you actually stood to benefit out of it, that would be a big thumbs up. So looking forward to actually hearing from you. And with that, I wish you all the very best. Get the maximum out of the remaining sessions. Hopefully, you will be able to relate to some of the aspects that I touched upon in my session when some of the deep dive technical sessions are actually in progress. And do give me your feedback. Thank you very much and wish you the very best.